My journey these past couple of years hasn't been easy. Good, bad, or indifferent, it was worth it. Throughout my journey, I had so many inspirations, so many things that made me see things in a different light, even view myself from a different perspective, understanding that I don't have to be just another statistic, that I can seek to be who I want to be, not who they set out for me to be. With that being said, this is my response to the legendary Pedro Pedri's Puerto Rican obituary, Puerto Rican resurrection. Hold up, what's going on? We've let too much time pass. It's been going on for far too long, struggling just to survive. Things seem so wrong. We worked, we were always on time. We were never late, just trying to survive. If it wasn't for Juan, Miguel, Milagro, Olga, Manuel, I would still be in denial. All dying for an American dream, waiting for their lottery numbers to hit, the promotion that never came and a system that never gave a fuck from the beginning. So understanding and learning everything they struggled through, why do we continue to keep the cycle going? While screaming, yo soy boricua, pa que tú lo sepa. Please tell me, what good does that do if we continue to contribute to the system that has us where we're at? And I'm not saying you got to be the next Captain Puerto Rico, I'm not saying all that. But let's look at the facts. So from 1493 until 1898, Spain ruled the island of Borinquen. And within that time, we'd had massive genocide. So many people died on both sides. And what do I mean by both sides? Our Afro and Taino side that we could never deny because we hold with so much pride everything they went through just to survive, while the conquistadors took the whole island on a ride, committing so many criminal acts that words can never describe. 1898, here comes big old Tío Sam, el savior de Puerto Rico, decreasing the currency by 40%. Cause who needs to survive when you got Tío Sam's checks by your side? Can't forget about the imposement of citizenship, forcing us to rely, while Tío Sam takes a ride on the road of taxation without representation, and that comes with a lot of exploitation. Oh, what a great nation of which we reside. But what I realize, if you remove us from history, we don't see a future. This is why it's important to understand who is Pedro Avisu Campos, who is Arturo Alfonso Chambre, who is Lolita Lebron, who is Ramon Emeterio Betances, who is Mariana Bracetti, who are the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, who are the Young Lords. All representation of greatness, all in their own right. But we are them and they are us, fighting for the same cause, liberation, self-determination, with no limitations. So we won't be dying, hating the make-believe steaks or the bulletproof rice and beans, or waiting for the supervisor to die to get that promotion. We will die freeing our bodies without having to use physical strength, but by arming ourselves with knowledge and education, not just for now, but for the future. Viva Puerto Rico libre, pa'lante, siempre pa'lante. Top of the afternoon, everybody, peace and blessings. We about to get started. Top of the afternoon, everybody, peace and blessings to everybody. So we're going to continue where we left off for Chapter 8, Puerto Rico National History. Don't forget, we upload every live onto YouTube. So if you see it right here in the background, that's the YouTube channel, Afro Taino 88. So if you missed any of the chapters or you want to look at some of the other books we've gone over, do me a favor, jump over to Afro Taino 88 and you'll be able to catch up with all the content we put out here on the book club. So I appreciate everybody tapping in. Oh, I hit a button, it didn't go. There you go. Happy New Year. Good afternoon. Let's get right into it, y'all. We got 4 hours and 26 minutes left of the book. Let's get about an hour and a half in, so that way we can get one step closer to finishing this book.
Chapter 9, The Great Migration. Those who left the archipelago to try their luck in the United States during the middle of the 20th century had different experiences depending on which Puerto Rico they inhabited. An urban middle-class family could migrate via steamships while drinking wine and eating crab meat cocktail and fried filet of sole à la Meunière, while a working-class youngster might have saved just enough money for his tickets, doing chivos here and there. Just as there was no single Puerto Rico, there was no universal migration experience. Around 835,000 left the archipelago from 1940 to 1970, and their migration impacted both their communities back home and where they arrived.
Listen up, let's tap that screen.
Each migration story was different, but there were also commonalities. While the Puerto Rican government created the infrastructure that made possible what became known as the Great Migration, many felt that migrating was a difficult and entirely personal decision. Such was the case of Doña Gabriela, an older woman with 2 sons, Luis and Chaguito, and a daughter, Juanita, all of whom struggled financially in San Juan's countryside. While Puerto Rico experienced great transformations during the 1940s and 1950s, those who lived in the countryside felt outside the modernizing project, even when the PPD's target electorate was the peasantry. After much debate, Luis, Doña Gabriela's eldest son and the family's main breadwinner, convinced them to try their luck in the city. The city, however, was not what they expected. San Juan, like Puerto Rico as a whole, was segregated according to social and class status. Luis and his family did not live in the elegant colonial houses near the city's bustling plazas. They could only afford a modest house in the extramural working-class neighborhood of La Perla, which began as a community of formerly enslaved workers and eventually became associated with poverty and the lower classes. Its location, outside the city walls, only added to its notoriety. After moving to La Perla, things did not change for the better for Luis and his family. His younger brother, Chaguito, was arrested on multiple occasions for petty theft. Steady work was hard to come by, and Luis felt that his sister, Juanita, challenged his authority by dating multiple men. For Doña Gabriela, life in San Juan felt like a punishment. The sounds of waves crashing and airplanes overhead were a constant reminder of the possibility of leaving for allá afuera. The family eventually made the trip abroad, joining hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans seeking better opportunities in the northeastern cities of the United States. But Luis and the family did not find much happiness in New York either. He now could afford a radio, fake jewelry, and a jacket for his mother. But Chaguito was behind prison bars in Puerto Rico. His mother longed for the countryside in her homeland, and his sister continued challenging his position as patriarch, this time becoming a sex worker. Yet Luis and Juanita worked. They joined thousands of others like Juan, Miguel, Milagros, Olga, and Manuel. They worked and were always on time. They were never late, never spoke back when they were insulted, never took days off. Luis never went on strike. Much like Bernardo, a worker from the town of Las Marias, Luis had hopes of one day returning to Puerto Rico. They never did. Bernardo worked in a factory and died from exhaustion. Luis died after his body was trapped in a pot-making machine. Juan died dreaming about a new car. Miguel died dreaming of new anti-poverty programs. Milagros died dreaming of a trip to Puerto Rico. Olga died dreaming of real jewelry. Manuel died dreaming about the Irish sweepstakes. These stories never happened. They are fictional characters in the play La Carreta by René Marquez, and in the poems Boricua en la Luna, Boricua in the Moon by Juan Antonio Corretjer, and Puerto Rican Obituary by Pedro Pietri. The stories, however, serve as a powerful invitation to remember the hundreds of thousands of people whose lives and histories never made it into the history books. They are similar to stories I heard from my grandparents about racism, classism, heartbreak, and the pain of winters. Yet Puerto Ricans did create community. They created a sense of belonging on the Lower East Side of Manhattan and in Philadelphia, Hartford, and Chicago. They brought with them ancestral knowledges, culture, and culinary traditions. In the process, Puerto Ricans created a diaspora that forces us to once again rethink what constitutes the Puerto Rican nation. Modernization and migration. The migration of almost 1 million people did not happen by accident. Their lives were impacted by structural factors that pushed them to look for opportunities abroad. The Great Migration reconfigured social relations and disrupted communities in Puerto Rico. Many left the archipelago in tears. They prayed and hoped for a speedy return. Some never did. Their families eventually joined them in the United States, where they created vibrant communities and bonds of solidarity. But many did return. In the 1970s, a circular migration began to take place and has continued ever since. Puerto Rican migration, however, did not begin in the 1950s. Puerto Ricans had been making their way to U.S. cities since the late 19th century. Pro-independence revolutionaries like Ramón Emeterio Betances and Eugenio María de Hostos, for example, spent time in New York City. They organized alongside Cubans who were fighting for their independence and navigated the city's racial dynamics. As previously mentioned, the Puerto Rican flag was a result of these interactions with members of the Cuban Revolutionary Party. Businessmen and members of the middle classes also migrated in search of better opportunities. The number of Puerto Ricans in the United States at the turn of the 20th century was not staggering. Shortly after the U.S. occupation and Hurricane San Ciriaco in 1899, about 5,000 Puerto Rican workers were recruited as agricultural workers in Hawaii. Puerto Ricans were seen as a displaceable labor force. By 1910, however, 1,513 Puerto Ricans were scattered across the mainland United States. These numbers grew exponentially in the following decades. By 1940, there were 69,967 Puerto Ricans in the United States. The passing of the Jones Act, which made Puerto Ricans citizens, was crucial in facilitating migration. These migrants did not come from the middle classes, nor were they swayed by revolutionary fervor. Most came from the working classes and migrated in search of opportunities in the United States post-World War II economy. The new transportation routes provided by steamships also facilitated the progress. Bernardo Vega and Jesus Colón, two working-class intellectuals who were part of that wave of migration and who are often referred to as pioneros, pioneers, left their impressions in the form of memoirs. Both were socialist militants, and their writings offer a window into the difficulties they faced. However, their memoirs also recall the joys of community, the beauty of the diasporic culture that was emerging, and the grassroots political organizing they participated in. From a few urban enclaves, Puerto Ricans began creating a community. Bodegas, small markets, became spaces for socialization, while civic and cultural associations offered an opportunity to meet other recently arrived migrants. By the mid-1940s, the migration process accelerated and became an exodus. This was due, in part, to the economic situation in both countries. Puerto Rico had been badly hit by the Great Depression, and jobs were scarce. The PPD's industrialization project triggered an internal migration from the countryside to urban centers, which in turn impacted the agricultural sector. The United States, on the other hand, was understood as a land of opportunity. After the end of World War II, the booming post-war economy created jobs, and there was a labor shortage. Since the very first days of the U.S. occupation, government officials had complained about the archipelago's surplus population. In 1901, for example, Governor Charles Allen noted, "Puerto Rico has plenty of laborers and poor people generally. What the island needs is men with capital, energy, and enterprise." In 1915, another colonial governor, Arthur Yeager, described the wretchedness and poverty among the masses, and explained, "I do not hesitate to express my belief that the only really effective remedy is the transfer of large numbers of Puerto Ricans to some other region." While promoting a populist discourse focusing on the poor, the PPD's economic policies paradoxically reproduced earlier themes and conversations around population density. Operation Bootstrap relied on foreign manufacturing companies that had been lured to the archipelago with tax exemptions. Thousands needed to migrate for industrialization to succeed.
Pay attention.
And while the government never officially promoted migration, it was seen as a necessary step toward modernization. On May 12, 1947, Puerto Rico's legislature approved Public Law 25. It created the Employment and Migration Bureau and clearly articulated the government's official stance on migration. The government of Puerto Rico does not stimulate or discourage the migration of Puerto Rican workers to the United States or any foreign country, but it deems its duty to duly orient them regarding the occupational opportunities and adjustment problems in ethnologically strange settings. Although he was one of its main proponents, this law did not stem solely from Luis Muñoz Marin's will and power. The PPD's cadre of intellectuals had closed ranks around the necessity of migration for the modernization of Puerto Rico. The University of Puerto Rico, UPR, also played a role in fostering these conversations and giving them an aura of intellectual legitimacy. When the UPR's Social Science Research Center, or SSRC, was being organized, Chancellor Jaime Benitez invited a University of Kansas and Columbia University graduate to help organize it. This young intellectual was Clarence Sr., a former member of the Socialist Party of America, known for being part of its militant faction. He befriended many people within the PPD, including Luis Muñoz Marin. In 1947, he published Puerto Rican Emigration, a book that set the tone for conversations within the archipelago's intelligentsia. Senior argued for the migration of Puerto Ricans to Latin America, but this proved too costly. His main thesis about the necessity of emigration echoed other conversations taking place in the Puerto Rican government. These conversations were driven by the same narrative that colonial governors had been articulating since the beginning of the 20th century. That is, they were framed as solutions to Puerto Rico's overpopulation. For example, a 1938 study by UPR sociologist Lawrence Chanot noted, "One important factor which can cause migration from a country as crowded as Puerto Rico is the lack of natural resources to support its growing population." But most migrants travel to New York City, which, as Edna Acosta Belén and Carlos E. Santiago have noted, had a population density almost 150 times higher than that of Puerto Rico at the time. Puerto Rico was no more populated than the cold northern cities that would receive these migrants. Aquí me muero de frío. I am dying of cold here. In 1916, the Puerto Rican modernist poet Virgilio Dávila published the poem Nostalgia in his book Aromas del Terruño. While his words struck patriotic and nationalist tones, they also read like a warning, presaging the experience of hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans in the coming decades. Mamá Borinquen me llama. Este país no es el mío. Borinquen es pura flama, y aquí me muero de frío. Mama, Borinquen is calling. This country is not mine. Borinquen is pure flame, and I am dying of cold here. Puerto Ricans migrated to urban enclaves in the Northeast with the help of government agencies and sponsored migrations, to borrow a phrase from Puerto Rican studies scholar Edgardo Meléndez. But migrants also depended on extended networks within the enclaves and communities already there.
Listen.
Correspondence, phone conversations, and photographs all created a feeling of proximity and, in a sense, acted as a lure to those back in the archipelago. The handwritten notes that accompanied the photographs sent back home, for example, described a life of happiness, success, and stability, even when these pictures were staged. The Puerto Rican government also sought to soften the cultural clash many felt upon arrival in the United States. In fact, as anthropologist Jorge Duani has noted, the Migration Division distributed millions of copies of publications orienting Puerto Ricans about American life and laws, as well as Americans about Puerto Rican culture. One such book was Emigración, published by the PPD's Division of Community Education, DIVEDCO. The book was part of the Libros del Pueblo, the People's Books series, which were central to the PPD's cultural project. Their topics ranged from hygiene to proper etiquette, from history to migration. Emigración began with a global history of migration and then moved on to explain the history of the United States. The idea was for migrants to understand the broader historical context they navigated, while also offering them an introduction to the histories of the places they were arriving at. One of the book's main arguments was that those who migrated needed to be prepared. While many used government programs in the Migration Division or the Department of Labor's Farm Labor Program, others simply migrated without any support, savings, or preparation. The book advised caution when making the decision to move abroad. In its pages, potential migrants could also read about weather in the United States, life in metropolitan cities, and xenophobia. Following the government line, the book argued that Puerto Ricans needed to work hard, adapt, and be loyal to the United States to challenge prejudices against them, portraying prejudice as the product of ignorance rather than structural inequality and systemic racism.
Talk about it.
While migrants arrived in different contexts, depending on the city or state, there was also a shared experience of navigating racism, xenophobia, and prejudice.
That's the culture here.
The Puerto Rican Migration Division office in Chicago warned against the creation of Puerto Rican enclaves in the city, even developing a campaign for Puerto Ricans to learn English to be able to fully navigate the city. Officials feared that if they settled in enclaves, as had happened in New York, they would never integrate into the city. What these officials failed to acknowledge was that Chicago was already racially segregated. Puerto Ricans occupied a liminal space within U.S. society. Not only had they received U.S. citizenship in 1917, but in 1940, Puerto Ricans were retroactively given birthright citizenship, which meant, according to legal scholar Charles Venator Santiago, birth in Puerto Rico was tantamount to birth in the United States. This did not mean much when dealing with landlords, municipal officials, and neighbors. In the 1970s, sociologist Samuel Betances noted, "Blacks see Latinos as honorary whites, and whites see Latinos as honorary blacks, and that leaves Latinos in a racial no man's land." While ethnic and racial tensions created contention between Puerto Ricans and other migrant groups like Mexicans, their shared experiences navigating faulty school systems, broken down housing markets, and the brunt of U.S. racism also allowed them to create bonds of community and solidarity. The experience of Puerto Ricans arriving in Philadelphia was in many ways similar to that of other major urban enclaves. Puerto Rican migrants arrived expecting an abundance of work, only to find what historian Carmen Teresa Whalen has called a plethora of limited opportunities.
Nothing.
Puerto Ricans were confined to the secondary labor market in jobs that paid poorly, required few skills, and offered poor working conditions, little security, and few avenues for economic mobility. Bulletin, a local Philadelphia newspaper, documented in 1957 how a host of outsiders descend on the city. They are poverty-stricken and foreign, not necessarily alien, but strange. Such passages highlight the anxiety around Puerto Ricans and the lack of real understanding about their relationship to the United States. The reporter interviewed an obviously decent woman that said she didn't want Puerto Ricans as next-door neighbors. They were noisy, unclean, and, much as she hated to say it, dangerous. Such conditions also pushed Puerto Ricans to organize at a community level to change their immediate conditions. A younger generation of Puerto Ricans radicalized by...
I did a video a couple of days or maybe a week or so ago where I put up a clip of just the propaganda that was going on in the news during the Cuban migration. And I tell people all the time, if you really listen to the propaganda that's perpetuated, especially coming from country where you have a lot more people of color, it's the same ignorance, lateral violence that they perpetuate about everybody coming into this country. And then it's crazy because we fall victim to it because we're listening to the media and we consuming all this propaganda and we start believing a lot of what they're saying and we start perpetuating a lot of these theories ourselves, not realizing that this is what they want. They want us to be against one another. They want us to discriminate against people who are coming into this country. We don't want the masses to understand our participation in disrupting and destroying their economies, right? Because if you understand that, you would give a fuck more on people coming over here because you understood the participation of your government in destroying their way of living, right?
The Cuban Revolution created militant groups like the Young Lords, the U.S. branches of the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, and armed organizations like the Frente Armado de Liberación Nacional. But revolutionary rhetoric was not the only organizing tool used by Puerto Ricans. Many Puerto Ricans joined civic organizations and sought to become part of their city's social fabric. From 1970 to 1972, Puerto Ricans led anywhere from 217 to 469 different civic organizations in New York City. They also participated in electoral politics through grassroots activism. In 1937, for example, Puerto Ricans successfully organized to elect Felipe Torres, the first Puerto Rican in New York's legislature. This was followed by many council members and other officials, leading to the election of Jorell Badillo to Congress in 1970. Music and the arts were other important avenues through which Puerto Ricans created a sense of belonging. In the world of letters, poets created spaces to share and theorize their realities and liminal existences. The term Nuyorican, often used as a derogatory word for Puerto Ricans who had settled in the United States, was resignified. For example, the New Yorican Poets Cafe became a central point of encounter for those in the diaspora.
Which I would have loved if you would have mentioned it, right? But that term was coined by Puerto Ricans from the islands to kind of separate the difference between the ones that were born on the states and one born on the mainland. And what I like to bring up is sometimes we perpetuate a lot of the traits from colonialism from our prior colonizers, because that's something that the Spanish used to do. They used to identify, it didn't matter if, say, your mom and dad were both born in Spain, but they had you outside of Spain, you were considered less than on the bracket, of their status. So when we do that to ourselves, that's just us perpetuating the same narratives that our colonizers, once used to perpetuate onto us and to their own. I'm just throwing that out there. That's what these terms that we have to be very crucial when we critiquing and analyzing history. I think it's dope that, again, I'm born and raised in New York City. I wear that term New Yorican on my sleeve. But we also have to understand where that comes from. That comes from internalized, issues we have within our people and our culture. But we about unity here, right?
It also offered a safe space for queer folks navigating the hostility of the city and Puerto Rican machismo.
Talk about it.
As performance scholar Karen Jaime has noted, the cafe, since its inception, functioned as a space for artistic and sexual exploration, experimentation, and the challenging of identitarian fixity. The queer community is an important element of Puerto Rican realities in New York City.
Talk
Yet
about it.
It is often ignored in mainstream histories. One of the most revered and remembered activists, although she was ostracized in life and died in extreme poverty, was Sylvia Rivera, a trans organizer, sex worker, and revolutionary. Rivera's father was Puerto Rican and her mother was Venezuelan, but she was raised by her grandmother in a mostly diasporic Puerto Rican environment. Along with her African-American friend Marsha P. Johnson, Rivera claimed to be part of the famous Stonewall riots, an event that became a turning point for queer communities in the United States. Rivera
If you from New York City, you don't know these two individuals, you haven't been doing your due diligence and you haven't been doing your research.
At organizing, helping to found multiple organizations, and she was vocal about trans rights. In the early 1970s, she was also in dialogue with the Black Panther Party and the Young Lords Party. She was able to accomplish all of this while navigating a violent and poverty-stricken environment that did not accept her gender identity. While the situation was dire for many Puerto Ricans, others created a sense of home. They began to plant roots, fostering a sense of community within their neighborhoods. The phrase, "Aquí me quedo," I am staying here, became an important affirmation that later graced restaurants in Hartford and became the title of a history of Puerto Ricans in Connecticut. This sense of belonging was facilitated by the ever-changing idea of Puerto Rico itself. Puerto Ricans brought with them their traditions, customs, and values. While most lived in small, substandard apartments, it was there that they created a cultural microcosm.
Talk about it.
When asked about how they kept customs alive, an interviewee in a 1950 migration report responded, "Today is the last day of Christmas. It is the Three Kings Day. My wife and I are expecting a gang from Utuado coming to play the guitar, cuatro, huicharo, and the maracas. The neighbors probably are coming as soon as they hear the music." Not all Puerto Rican.
Really quick, this is good for a good plug-in. So this Sunday, I will be at the People's Church. We're celebrating Three Kings Day. There will be free clothes, free food, music, books for the kids, and I'm also premiering, which I uploaded yesterday, book 3 out of my graphic novel, Young Lord's Community Story. It's a children's books. It's up there on YouTube for audio listen. So if you guys want to go check that out too, please go check it up. I decided to put the third book because I was going to use it for this weekend for the church to listen with the kids. But I decided to put it on YouTube because you know what? I figured I could give, for 2025, I could put something out there in the atmosphere for good, right? So tap that screen, share this live. Don't forget, we will be at the People's Church from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. So if anybody is on 111th Street, come down. It's open to everybody to come down there. Peace, blessings, positivity. Let's get it.
Arrived and settled in urban enclaves. Through the Puerto Rican government's farm labor program, thousands were recruited to work in the fields of New York, Connecticut, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Florida, among other places. The well-oiled migration machine, created by the government, provided some guarantees that eased the process for those who wanted to migrate but did not have any savings, networks abroad, or English-speaking skills. Unlike other seasonal farm laborers, such as the braceros, Puerto Ricans possessed U.S. citizenship. But as anthropologist Ismael Garcia Colon has noted, Puerto Rican farm workers are both expendable and disposable. Expendable because they can be replaced with guest and undocumented workers, and disposable because their U.S. citizenship does not protect them from discrimination in an industry that takes advantage of immigrants. Once they arrived, most farm workers were confronted with the harsh reality of precarious labor conditions.
Most of these things are a continuation. A lot of the things that we're listening to, we're still going through today, is because a lot of these things aren't rectified, right? And it's because we're not looking at the issue itself. We're looking around. Like I always compare it to like a cake, right? When you go into a bakery, you buy a cake not based off the frosting, the design, the name, the flowers. You buy it based off what's inside, what's the core element of the cake, what makes the cake. And I think when we have our issues and we look at issues, we get so caught up on the trinkets surrounding the major issue, and we don't attack the major issue that has the core elements to even layer on top all this nice little things to have us distracted. If you guys understand what I mean, I know maybe my analogy wasn't perfect today, but if you guys follow the concept, we don't really pay attention to the core issues. We sit here and we get caught up on the miscellaneous things that really don't have anything to do with what really happened, but because it catches our attention, it throws us off. We never focus on what the real problems are.
They worked long hours in the fields,
right,
only to sleep in barracks that resembled prisons. In addition, they were often not paid what they were owed for their labor. Some were able to save enough money to send back home. Others made their way to the closest city. They wrote letters to government officials and even to Luis Muñoz Marin, Puerto Rico's governor, about how they had been abandoned and left behind. Notwithstanding the hardships faced by many, these migrations also set the foundations for Puerto Rican enclaves in states along the East Coast and across the Midwest. By the 1970s, the modernization project launched in Puerto Rico was showing signs of fatigue. In the United States, economic crisis triggered a rise in unemployment. The plethora of limited opportunities offered by migration had also waned. It was more difficult for Puerto Ricans to find steady jobs or sources of income. And yet many stayed.
Well, we got to understand, too, whatever happens to the United States, as long as Puerto Rico's been under the United States, it happens to Puerto Rico double. So anytime we have an economy crisis here in the United States and, jobs aren't going well and the economy's fucked up, that is intensified by 10 in Puerto Rico. And that's something we have to understand. And a lot of the policies also hinder Puerto Rico from creating their own economy for them not to have to go under the same way the United States goes under. But since they can't build their own economy because of things like the Jones Act, they have no choice but to rely on somebody who's on a sinking ship as well.
Planted roots and gave birth to generations of Puerto Ricans in the diaspora. While some may never have visited the archipelago or even spoken Spanish, They carried with them a sense of pride and belonging to the Puerto Rican nation. Thousands, however, decided to return.
And I think people got to understand those nuances, right? Some people were able to go back, some people had to stay. But I think what we have to understand as Boricuas, as Puerto Ricanos in general, is that regardless of where you reside, you are a continuation of the struggle. Because the reason you left the islands was because of geopolitical and economical reasons. And the reason you still struggle here is because you're a continuation of that struggle trying to make it in a society that wasn't set up for you or me. So we have to look at that and look at as our history, not individual histories, not different components. It's all the same story, just different chapters. And we have to have a full understanding. To really understand the full Boricua experience, we have to have a complete understanding of the Boricua experience in its entirety, if you get what I mean.
Returning.
There we go.
In 1972, Luis Muñoz Marín returned to Puerto Rico. The leader of the PPD had left Puerto Rico in 1968 after his party's first major defeat in that year's election. The Partido Nuevo Progresista, New Progressive Party, or PNP, won the ballot box after a major split within the PPD. Tensions came to the fore after a plebiscite regarding Puerto Rico's political status held on July 23, 1967. Those who favored independence abstained and received 1% of the vote, while those who supported annexation received 30%. The Commonwealth emerged victorious with 60% of the vote.
I'm gonna be honest. I think even this conversation, I guess, with like the voting for the, I wasn't born there, so I understand. For me, I'm limited on even my opinions on what the island should do, right? But I think if we're gonna have votes and people who lived on the island or born on the island at one point and was forced to leave due to displacement, I don't feel like those individuals should be X'd out of any votes for the future of the island, because like I said, they're a continuation. Like the reason they came over here is because of the political and economical factors that they went through. So for me, I'm looking at it like at least individuals who were born out there and maybe live outside in the diasporas, maybe they should have some type of input too. I'm not saying everybody, because like I said, I wasn't born there, so I get it. But individuals like my mom that was forced out because of the geopolitical reasons, my dad, you know what I'm saying? Like those individuals, for me, it's like you're just taking away from the numbers of what people really go through, because a lot of people who migrate here is because they're suffering economically. So when you take away their vote, it's like you displace them, you remove them from that. Like that's what they do at the ballot box, right? That's what you do with communities, with gentrification, where you push people out so that way you can control the voting pool and get them to be able to vote the way you want them to be able to vote. Because a lot of individuals who get stuck on the island, the highest populations of seniors. So what do the seniors rely on? They rely on a lot of welfare, Medicaid, like public assistance, like that. So that's who you have voting, because you have them in fear of losing those things because they're already at a stage in their life where they can't afford to have any of these things missing. That's my opinion. Don't shoot the messenger. That's just how I look at it. Again, I'm not saying, because I know this gets very sensitive when we talk about the position of the island and the diaspora. Oh, you wasn't born there. But what happens to the individuals that were born there? What happened to the thousands and hundreds of people who were displaced just from, like, say, the last 20 years through all the hurricanes that went through over there? The economical factors. People who can't make it back and feel like if they had to say so, they would vote for this or they would vote for that. That's my opinion. If y'all, I don't know. I'm scared to ask what y'all think, but I'm going to ask what y'all think. Tell me if I'm bugging.
Governor Roberto Sánchez Vilella had won the 1964 election with the endorsement of Luis Muñoz Marín. Both leaders broke off their collaborative relationship when Sánchez Vilella joined the party's leftist faction, which became critical of the 1965 U.S. occupation of Santo Domingo and the military draft of Puerto Ricans. This faction eventually boycotted the plebiscite and created a new political party, Partido del Pueblo, People's Party. These divisions led the PPD to lose the 1968 ticket to the PNP, the new party that had also split from the statehood party due to differing views on the plebiscite. Muñoz Marin referred to his time abroad as voluntary exile. Unlike the hundreds of thousands of people who decided to migrate back to Puerto Rico, given the difficult economic situation they faced in the United States, Muñoz Marin spent his time in Rome thinking about the future of his party and of Puerto Rico, which he considered inseparable. When Muñoz Marin left the country, he did not know when or even if he would return. The PNP's victory in 1968 caused him great concern. These elections marked the beginning of Puerto Rico's two-party system, which continues to the present day. Until then, the PPD's party structure had not been formally institutionalized, as it revolved around the figure of Muñoz Marin himself. The party needed to be reinvigorated if it was to win the elections in 1972. It needed to continue without its charismatic but aging leader. The Commonwealth status the party had created in the 1950s was now threatened by the possibility of U.S. annexation of Puerto Rico. The PNP's platform was based on Puerto Rico obtaining statehood. Hawaii and Alaska had been incorporated in 1959. 2 years later, a constitutional amendment granted Washington, D.C. voting rights. The PNP leaders were hopeful that Puerto Rico would become a state in the span of a decade.
Listen, Puerto Rican's economy is all going to be dependent on how the United States decides to approach them. Do they want to approach Puerto Rico as an ally, and do they want to help them set up for success? Because for 126 years, taxing us on the Jones Act, stealing resources, at least you could do is be an ally. I'm not asking for you to give us no money and none of that, but not to restrict us from doing business with anybody else. Puerto Rico is the geographical location that it's in. It's the middle of the pit stops to be able to get resources to other places and even to itself, and the other resources that it could provide on itself. A lot of people don't know, the United States extracts electricity from Puerto Rico with their wind farms that they've built and they invested in on the island, because they're using the natural resources that the island produces, the wind, right, to be able to generate energy. So when you look at things like that, the island can do many things to sustain on its own. It just needs the opportunity. We don't know what Puerto Rico is going to look like being independent, is because since 1493, it hasn't been given the opportunity to be independent. All I'm saying, they need an opportunity. That's right. We need an opportunity to try to at least do something. There's so many different factors. There's so many different trades. There's so many different elements to be able to do for ourselves, but we're not given that opportunity. So like I said, what it looks like, I'm not too sure, but I know it'll look a lot better than somebody restricting you and limiting you what you can and cannot do. And that's where we at right now. We're limited.
Leader Luis A. Ferré predicted would happen. A month before the elections, in October 1972, the PPD announced Luis Muñoz Marin's return. A massive political rally to celebrate was planned in the parking lot of San Juan's Plaza La...
When people say that Puerto Rico is going to become like Cuba, it's going to become like Venezuela, people use the examples that the United States has the most economical fucking blockades on them, the most sanctions on them. People won't do business with these countries because they don't want to fall out with the United States. And that's what it all depends on. If Puerto Rico becomes free and independent, if the United States wants to allow them to be free and independent, they can flourish. But if the United States wants to do what they're doing and do it like neo-colonialism, where they're controlling the country after they set it free, like some Britain shit, then they only gonna fall again. So like I say, it all depends, and I don't see the United States as the end or be all. You just got to look at who's the powerhouse in the region and who's controlling the economical factors on this side. It sucks, bro. It sucks. Again, I'm a realist too. I don't look at things I want independence, I want this, that, and the third, but I'm also a realist too. You got to have a plan. You just can't leap in faith of independence and say, hey, we're going to be successful. You got to prepare for that shit.
Americas, the Caribbean's largest shopping mall.
Listen, I'm gonna stop pausing it, but I'm gonna let it play. If we want to get rid of the Jones Act, I'm gonna be honest with you, it's gonna take more than Puerto Rico. We need to get all U.S. territories that's really impacted economically by the Jones Act to make a real impact, because they're not just gonna listen to a small group. Well, we're not small, but in their eyes, we're a small group of people who are complaining about something that other people are going through, but they're not saying nothing. So we can get together as like what I call the Jones Act diaspora and come together and really show how this is a major issue that impacts everyone, especially in the Caribbean island that relies, like Puerto Rico, for things to be shipped there. Oil, food, other resources, products, materials, all of that is controlled by the Jones Act. I don't think many people really understand like how deep the Jones Act really goes when it comes to the economical aspect and the taxing and the limiting of who you can't do business with.
Approximately 150,000 rank-and-file members of the PPD showed up, eager to hear their leader. Upon his return, he gave a speech and threw his support behind the party's electoral candidate, Rafael Hernández Colón, securing Colón's victory the following month. Historian Silvia Álvarez Curvelo called this event the PPD's coup de gracia.
Well, all right, I know I said I was going to stop pausing. But the debt is so large is because they allow faulty debts that wouldn't be legal or legal to sell in the United States. They allowed them to be sold in Puerto Rico. So the debt that we have is the debt that was created. They knew that was going to happen. That was the point. The point was to keep Puerto Rico in a position where they won't thirst and they always rely on the United States, because financially they won't be able to sustain on their own because of the debt they acquired. We gotta play chess, not checkers. They not playing a short game. They playing the long game. So when we really look at these economical issues, like the United States thought about this in advance. Their plans are coming into fruition with every act that they've passed. As we listen to this book, when you talk about, the Great Migration, Operation Bootstrap, then we talk about what was the other one called? Something the something flow or something like that. If you look, they all built up to create the conditions that we have today. The valve, there you go. It was the valve migration.
The rally can also be understood symbolically, and in this way, it was a historical turning point. While the PPD had presented itself from its beginnings as the party of the poor, this event took place in the quintessential symbol of Puerto Rico's emerging consumerist culture, Plaza Las Américas. The event also marked Muñoz Marin's return, just as hundreds of thousands of Puerto Rican migrants were also returning to the archipelago.
And somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't Plaza de America the largest mall in the Caribbean islands? Anybody in the comments, correct me if I'm wrong?
These anonymous workers had not spent their time in the United States pondering the muses. Rather, they had worked in factories, hustled in the streets, or committed themselves to grassroots community and political organizing. When Muñoz Marin gave his speech, it was clear that the modernization project had failed. Heralded as an economic miracle by many, or as democracy's laboratory in Latin America, in Time magazine's second cover article dedicated to Luis Muñoz Marin, modernization was nonetheless a bust. Although Muñoz Marin argued that neither independence nor statehood was realistic, the Commonwealth was beginning to collapse. Puerto Rico was hit hard by the 1973 oil crisis and ensuing U.S. recession. The local agricultural industry all but disappeared, leaving thousands of people without steady income. Unemployment reached 17%, while the country's gross national product fell from 7% in 1960 to 3.3% in the following decade. Poverty.
And then limiting who you can and cannot do business with is more crucial to the situation, man. It's why I told you when you rely on a sinking ship to save you, how much logical sense does that make? It doesn't, but that's the situation the United States created economically with Puerto Rico and other territories.
Was rampant. forcing the Puerto Rican government to lobby for an extension of the Nutritional Assistance Plan and federal food stamps to the archipelago to assist low-income families. Instead of fostering the expansion of local agricultural production, these funds were spent on imports from the United States. In the United States, Puerto Ricans faced a decline in manufacturing and the expansion of a service economy that displaced many of them.
Listen.
Given the limited opportunities available during an economic recession and the restructuring of urban areas in the Northeast and Midwest, many Puerto Ricans decided to return to the archipelago. Between 1975 and 1980, 137,000 Puerto Ricans went back to their homeland, while migration to the United States dwindled to 65,817 during those years. Many traveled with children and adolescents who had been born abroad and now returned to live in the nostalgic land of their parents. Those who participated in the circular migration that began in the 1970s cannot be reduced to numbers and data. Flights arriving in San Juan were loaded with Puerto Ricans who had a new understanding of what being Puerto Rican meant. The returning migrants also created new understandings of the nation that included those who had decided to stay behind and celebrate Three Kings Day with the warmth of family and community as an escape from the cold. Some were coming back home. Others stayed home in New York, Milwaukee, Hartford, or Worcester. All of these urban enclaves were extensions of a nation that was not defined by geographic boundaries and that existed notwithstanding colonial erasures and imperial violence. Chapter 10: The Cold War and the New Push for Independence.
Really quick, we got 20 people in here. We had 12K. Let's step it up a notch. Let's try to get to 20K. We got 44 minutes and 7 seconds left of this chapter. So let's end it out with a bang. Let's tap that screen. Let's shoot up to 20K. Keep sharing this live. And if this is your first time here, I do believe in socialism, free education, free housing, and free healthcare. So by tapping that screen, sharing this live, it's showing me a little bit of socialist love and support to be able to reach the masses. Without further ado, let's get right back into it.
In the late 1930s, Luis Muñoz Marin traveled Puerto Rico's countryside gathering votes and attracting people to the recently formed Popular Democratic Party, or PPD. One of the party's catchphrases, which became part of its anthem, was "Halda arriba," up the hillside. On his visits to the western town of Mayagüez, Muñoz Marin stopped in Ricardo Trabal's Gallera cockpit. Cockfighting was an important social event in rural Puerto Rico. Trabal, one of the founding members of Mayagüez's PPD branch, was also an ardent believer in Puerto Rico's independence. Muñoz Marin's visits were an event, and Francisca Rivera, Ricardo's wife, made sure to cook her famous rice and chicken for him. During one such visit, Ricardo and Francisca's daughter, Providencia Trabal, met her political hero, Muñoz Marin. Providencia, known as Pupa, had been born into extreme poverty on May 1st, 1926. Wanting a better life for their child, her birth parents gave her to her godparents, Ricardo and Francisca, who raised her like their own. Pupa recounts that she had a humble and happy life. In grade school, she met a shy boy who was raised as a bourgeois and excelled in all his classes. His name was Juan Maribras. He later became a prominent lawyer, an important figure in Puerto Rico's pro-independence movement, and one of Pupa's lifelong friends. Pupa was a young girl the day she met Muñoz Marin. She sat in his lap, and Muñoz Marin told her, "The patria, fatherland, is always first. And the first thing that you need to love in your life is the patria." When the PPD won the 1940 elections, There was a huge celebration in Pupa's household. They supported the party until Muñoz Marin, as Pupa later described, became a coward and declared independence incongruent with being a popular. It was then that she broke away from the PPD and dedicated her life to the struggle for Puerto Rico's independence. She eventually married Néstor Nazario Grillo, a pharmacist from a middle-class family who shared her political commitments. Pupa was an avid organizer and a dedicated worker, involved in any activity that could advance her ideals. She was also a medium and opened a Spiritist center in her house located in Mayagüez's number 11 San Vicente Street. Pupa's practice granted her the respect and love of her community. She also used the Spiritist Center as a space to host pro-independence meetings. Pupa's activism caught the attention of the archipelago's police department. They began surveilling her activities in 1956, the same year that a group of university students created the Federación Universitaria Pro Independencia, Pro-Independence University Federation, or FUPI. Pupa was eventually expelled from the Partido Independentista Puertorriqueño, or PIP, along with other dissident members who criticized the party's bureaucratization and its sole focus on electoral politics. Many of those dissatisfied with the PIP began meeting to talk about creating other alternatives. On January 11, 1959, a group of independentistas gave a televised speech advocating for the advancement of Puerto Rico's liberation. That same evening, a meeting took place in Pupa's house. It included her former classmate Juan Maribras, along with other comrade independentistas. So many people joined the meeting that it had to be moved outdoors to the patio. There they created a new organization, the Movimiento Pro Independencia, Pro-Independence Movement, or MPI. Pupa's life was the embodiment of sacrifice to a higher ideal, that of independence. A founding member of both the MPI and the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, or PSP, she collaborated actively with their newspaper Claridad and founded a women's Masonic lodge. She even met with Latin American revolutionaries like the Chilean poet Pablo Neruda, future Chilean President Salvador Allende, and the Cuban revolutionary Fidel Castro. Pupa always bragged about her cooking and recalled the time she made almojábanas, cheese-flavored roll made with corn flour for the Cuban leader. Constantly harassed by authorities, who even planted bombs in a pharmacy she owned with her husband, she was arrested on several occasions on fabricated accusations. Pupa lived a revolutionary life in revolutionary times. Being an independentista in Puerto Rico during the 1960s and 1970s could be dangerous. Those who carried the Puerto Rican flag were targeted as potential subversives. Pupa Trabal's life is an example of the hardships faced by so many. She was harassed and framed for crimes she did not commit. As a woman, she also faced discrimination within her own ranks. When Pupa met Salvador Allende in Chile, they had a brief but powerful exchange. She referred to him as the next president of the country, but he laughed and said that would not happen. She insisted, perhaps confident in her spiritist sense. He said that if he did become president, she would be the first person invited to his inauguration. When the invitation arrived from President Allende, she excitedly told her old friend Juan Maribras, by then the MPI's undisputed leader. He dissuaded Pupa from going, saying that it would be more appropriate for a member of the PIP to attend such an occasion. This might have also been an example of the misogyny and machismo that so many women denounced from their ranks. While people had been advocating and fighting for independence throughout the 20th century, new and different forms of understanding, repertoires of struggles, and cross-class collaborations marked the period known as the New Struggle for Independence. Revolutionary winds were again blowing in Puerto Rico, but with them came debris in the form of colonial violence and state repression. The turbulent 1960s and 1970s. The creation of new pro-independence organizations in the 1950s marked a turning point for Puerto Rico's anti-colonial movements. National liberation struggles were claiming victories in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and these new organizations were highly influenced by unraveling events in the Third World. The MPI, for example, was originally imagined as a multi-class coalition that centered their agenda around the independence of Puerto Rico, but later became a working-class party. Even after it morphed into a Marxist-Leninist group, it retained its national liberation ethos. In the process, the MPI became one of the most important organizations of the period, able to attract students, workers, and professionals to its ranks. This also made the MPI a target of the Puerto Rican Police Department, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI, and its counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO. Since its inception, the MPI had wanted to gain influence on a national scale. They created a far-reaching grassroots project through cells known as misiones, missions. According to Cesar Andreu Iglesias, a founding member and influential Marxist intellectual of the time, the struggle should not be led by a single organization but by various groups united in the same goal of independence. To do so, the MPI needed to create various fronts within the working classes, cultural institutions, and electoral politics. While not included in Andreu Iglesias' conceptualizations, students later became central political figures in the movement. 10 days before the MPI's founding meeting, on Pupa's patio, a group of revolutionaries 1,000 miles away had triumphantly marched in Havana. Fidel Castro's revolution had succeeded in toppling Fulgencio Batista's government in Cuba. The Cuban revolutionaries had accomplished what seemed impossible. They were able to overthrow Batista's dictatorship and, later, declare the revolution communist. All this a mere 90 miles from the United States. Their success and the defiant anti-imperialist discourse of the Cuban Revolution was appealing to a generation of Latin American radicals who felt disenfranchised and left behind by the promises of modernization. Ernesto Che Guevara's Guerrilla Handbook, published and widely distributed by the Cuban government, also added fuel to an already flammable moment. Armed guerrilla movements sought to emulate the Cuban experience. Guevara's Foco theory was particularly popular. Unlike traditional Marxism, he argued that a small band of committed rural guerrilla fighters could create the conditions for revolution. Many groups also experimented with the Foco theory in urban settings with various degrees of success. The Cuban Revolution sent shockwaves across the Americas. Puerto Rico was no exception. The MPI's first resolution, formulated that night in Pupa's house, was to send a fraternal salute and congratulations to Commander Fidel Castro. The second was to formally create a 15-member organizing committee. As expected, the MPI began collaborating with the Cuban cause almost immediately. In the MPI's foundational assembly, which took place in November 1959, Che Guevara himself sent a letter saluting the newly established organization. The bonds of solidarity and collaboration only intensified during the 1960s. The MPI was invited to participate in the Tricontinental Conference that took place in Havana and included hundreds of delegates from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It was there, for example, that the Puerto Rican revolutionary leader Filiberto Ojeda Ríos met with people like Salvador Allende from Chile, Amílcar Cabral from Guinea-Bissau, and Juan Bích Sun from Vietnam. The MPI opened the mission in Havana that became the Misión de Puerto Rico in Cuba, an organization that survived the MPI and still operates today. A former MPI member noted that Cuba also provided tactical support to the Puerto Rican revolutionary struggle via funding, weapons, and military training. Members of the MPI, then, saw themselves as the defenders and promoters of the Cuban Revolution in Puerto Rico. This made them the target of right-wing Cuban exiles' paramilitary groups. Immediately after the Cuban Revolution succeeded, right-wing groups began organizing across the Caribbean basin with the support of federal agencies like the FBI and the CIA. Some of them had legitimate fronts and were registered as non-profit organizations in Puerto Rico's Department of State. Their names are quite telling: Frente de Liberación Nacional Cubano, Cuban National Liberation Front, Ejército Latinoamericano Anticomunista, Anti-Communist Latin American Army, and Omega 7. Beyond advocacy, these groups used armed tactics to advance their objectives. There were at least 303 acts of terrorism perpetrated by Cuban exiles and other right-wing organizations in Puerto Rico from 1960 to 1990. These included kidnapping attempts, assassinations, and bombings. The MPI headquarters, its newspaper Claridad, and their printing press were recurrent targets. The Cuban government also championed the cause of Puerto Rico's independence on an international scale. Shortly after the creation of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, the United States advocated its elimination from the UN's list of colonies. The UN's General Assembly decided in a 1960 resolution that there were three ways of achieving self-government: independence, free association with an independent state, or integration into an independent nation-state. Another resolution also called for the unconditional end of colonialism across the world. In 1965, as decolonization movements proliferated in Africa and new nations joined the UN, Cuba asked that Puerto Rico be added to the UN Decolonization Committee's agenda. The discussion about Puerto Rico's colonial status was postponed until 1972. Cuba presented another motion to include Puerto Rico on the General Assembly's agenda. George H.W. Bush, the U.S. ambassador who later became U.S. president, objected and was able to garner the votes to block Puerto Rico's inclusion. The next year, the Decolonization Committee took up Puerto Rico's case again and invited members of Puerto Rican organizations to testify at the UN. Members of various pro-independence organizations like the MPI, the PIP, and the Puerto Rican Communist Party gave their testimony. In 1978, members of all the major political parties in Puerto Rico delivered speeches condemning the archipelago's colonial situation. UN debates about Puerto Rico pushed the U.S. Congress to pass a timid resolution reaffirming its commitment to respect and support the right of the people of Puerto Rico to determine their own political future through a peaceful, open, and democratic process. The resolution was dead on arrival, of course. But these conversations reveal that, regardless of political or ideological differences, members of Puerto Rico's political establishment all recognized that Puerto Rico was a colonial possession of the United States. As the UN conversations took place, the MPI continued promoting unity across all pro-independence organizations and efforts. This, however, was easier said than done. When the MPI allowed its members to vote in elections, some influential members abandoned the organization. Then, when the MPI decided to transform itself from a multi-class organization to a socialist one, conflicts and tensions arose once again from its rank-and-file members. And while the Cuban Revolution had not originally been a socialist struggle, it was only declared Marxist-Leninist by Fidel Castro in 1962, socialism proved highly influential in Puerto Rico, too. In the PIP, which had maintained an emphasis on electoral politics, a group of young radicals were expelled because they tried to move the party towards socialism. The Puerto Rican left was also inspired by the anti-Vietnam War movement taking place in the United States and around the world. University students from the FUPI joined forces with the MPI and others in organizing against U.S. militarism in Puerto Rico. One of their most successful campaigns was opposing the military draft. The strategy was to arrive at recruitment offices when summoned, but declined to swear allegiance to the United States. A pro-independence student named Sixto Albelo was the first of many to be arrested in the movement against the compulsory draft. Another heated campaign led by leftist organizations was against the Reserve Officers Training Corps, or ROTC program at the University of Puerto Rico. From 1960 until 1971, militant strikes and other actions left dozens of students, professors, and activists suspended or arrested. There were bombs found in the ROTC building on one occasion, and it was set on fire on another.
That's crazy.
There were also student and police casualties. Ultimately, the movement, with the support of a coalition of radical organizations, succeeded in forcing ROTC off campus. The revolutionary furor also gave way to a new wave of working-class militancy. The labor movement's combativeness had dwindled since the 1950s, when the PPD came to dominate the world of unions. By the 1960s, the resurgence of labor's militancy was due in part to the grassroots organizing of socialist and pro-independence groups. Perhaps the best example was the strike at a General Electric plant that lasted 9 months, from October 1969 to July 1970. The strike signaled the emergence of a new working-class radicalism that openly advocated for independence and socialism. Both the MPI and the FUPI were integral in the radicalization of workers. A new labor federation created in 1971 under the name of Movimiento Obrero Unido, or MOU, also coordinated various strikes and was composed of militant unions. More than 45,000 workers participated in the 166 strikes that took place between 1974 and 1975. The MOU played a crucial role in a strike at the newspaper El Mundo, which lasted 7 months. The newspaper decided to bring in scabs using a fleet of rented helicopters. In solidarity with the striking workers, an underground armed guerrilla movement destroyed 4 of those helicopters, causing damages estimated in the millions of dollars. In 1971, the MPI announced that it would become the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, or PSP. Given its Marxist-Leninist orientation, its leadership originally envisioned a working-class party. It was to become an instrument in their struggle for Puerto Rican independence, which, they believed, would only be attainable through socialism. While it attracted less than 1% of the vote in the 1976 and 1980 elections, the party's impact extended beyond the ballot box. Following the MPI's grassroots strategy, the PSP was able to create an impressive national network of municipal sections, or núcleos. These núcleos organized in schools and universities, job sites, and neighborhoods. The party strongly influenced both the organized labor movement and leftist student organizations. Too often ignored is the fact that its leadership believed in a plurality of tactics in their struggle for independence. Their newspaper, Claridad, for example, became a bulletin board used by many organizations to claim responsibility for certain military actions or to simply send messages to the government. Ex-MPI member Ángel Agosto also claims that the party created an armed unit of 247 members organized in 6 columns dispersed throughout the archipelago. By 1975, a PSP internal document noted that the party had 2,635 active members, 14,310 sympathizers, and 1,056 card-carrying militants. While these may have seemed like promising numbers, the MPI started to lose steam shortly afterward. Internal debates and tensions began to tear the party apart. While it started as a working-class organization, it later advocated for multi-class coalitions. This produced tensions that were only heightened by internal critiques of the party's decision to join electoral races. Their crushing defeats exacerbated the discontent. As a former MPI PSP militant once argued, "Esto se jodió cuando se fundó el PSP." This got fucked when the PSP was founded. By the end of the 1980s, the party was debilitated, and many of its members abandoned it. The PSP was part of a broader radical tradition stemming from the MPI, the Nationalist Party, and the PIP. All parties that understood the centrality of the Puerto Rican diaspora in the struggle for independence. Since its creation, the MPI has sustained and organized missions in the diaspora that sought to radicalize the vibrant Puerto Rican communities in the United States. Known as La Seccional, the sectional, this diasporic PSP successfully organized núcleos in New York, California, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, as well as in cities in the Midwest and the Northeast. For some of its members, the party helped them polish their Spanish language skills, expand their Puerto Rican consciousness, and deepen their relationship to the archipelago. The Seccional produced a short-lived English supplement to the Claridad newspaper and focused on pressing local issues affecting Puerto Ricans in the diaspora, as well as collaborating with other civil rights organizations. By the 1970s and 1980s, the term Nuyorican, which referred to Puerto Ricans living in New York, was used pejoratively by those who lived in the archipelago. In fact, some English-speaking PSP members felt that they, too, were treated differently by their comrades in Puerto Rico. Officially, however, the PSP stated that Puerto Ricans in the diaspora were part of the Puerto Rican nation and should work toward the independence of Puerto Rico while also advancing revolutionary and socialist struggles in the United States.
It's because we're a continuation.
While their reach and political influence might have been limited, this idea became an important intellectual counterpoint to think about the Puerto Rican nation as not simply contained within the Caribbean archipelago. Echoing the Cuban intellectual José Martí's famous phrase, "In the entrails of the beast," a 1972 PSP official document titled "In the Entrails" laid out the party's official stance. The PSP believed that Puerto Rico was a nation with its own national territory, language, culture, and history of colonialism and racism. The migration and settlements of Puerto Ricans in the United States represented a new extension of that nation, not the creation of a new people in the form of a national minority. They also believed that only after Puerto Rico's independence could Puerto Ricans be considered a national minority in the United States. The PSP was not the only organization reimagining the concept of the nation. As part of the broader civil rights movement in the United States, a younger generation of Puerto Ricans born in the diaspora began to combine the struggle for independence with a desire to transform the precarious realities of their families in their barrios. They were tired of the poverty and discrimination that affected their working-class neighborhoods.
But I think that's what separates a lot of us right now, right? It's like a lot of the motherland's not taught about the history of the diasporans, and the diasporans isn't told about much history of the motherland, and that's due to the educational system. But that's a divide and conquer tactic where we start looking at each other, and this is where the trauma competition of who did what and who went through what. And it's like, when you look at it, bro, we both fucking suffer through the same system that keeps us where we're at. Now, we ain't gonna figure it out together. We just gonna keep going through the same shit, because it's about numbers. Individualism doesn't work against colonial powers. It really doesn't. It takes the efforts of the collective. As much people don't want to come to terms with that, and people get stuck on the individualism, the egotistical shit, the reality is that individualism does not fucking work.
For this younger generation, poverty, both at home and in Puerto Rico, was the product of imperialism, capitalism, and racism. Influenced by the Black Panther Party, the Chicano civil rights movement in the West, and the anti-Vietnam War movement, a street gang led by José Chacha Jiménez became the Young Lords organization in 1969. It quickly spread to New York,
1968, not 1969.
Philadelphia, and Chicago. The New York branch broke away from Chicago and became the Young Lords Party. Many of its members were young adults and teenagers, second-generation
New York came to be in 1969.
Puerto Ricans living in impoverished communities. Imbued in the moment's radical ethos, the Young Lords saw themselves as part of an anti-imperialist internationalist movement that sought to topple capitalism. In the process, they also challenged ideas about race, sexuality, and gender in their local communities.
Yep.
While the Young Lords Party existed only until 1976, their effective use of mass media and the boldness of some of their actions caught the public's imagination.
And this is why a lot of people get confused with, it overlaps, right? Where a lot of people give credit to New York's actions and they predate that before Chicago, when in reality, a lot of the things that were done in Chicago first, and then, you know, New York modeled themselves after the actions that were done also in Chicago and emulated them in their own way. Did they enhance it? Hell yeah. Did they figure out a way to create an outlet that can generate enough traction that could get to the people? Yeah, that was it. That was the success of the New York Young Lords. If you really look at the New York Young Lords, a lot of them ended up going into careers of like journalism, reporting, talk show hosts, radio analysts, and a lot of that came through the experience the experiences that they gained with the things that they learned as Young Lords, you know, with the newspaper, with the talking to the press, talking to the media, having to do their own research. A lot of the things that they acquired as Young Lords opened the doors for them to be able to use that to be able to acquire careers later on down the line. There's many Yoruba, Felipe Luciano, Juan Gonzalez, and so on and so forth. You can mention a lot of them where they're like top tier journalists or reporters.
They burned their neighborhood's trash in the middle of the street when the city failed to pick it up. Members ran community programs around childcare and free meals. They also occupied several churches, parks, and hospitals. In 1970, for example, the Young Lords occupied Lincoln Hospital for several hours After a series of deaths due to negligence on the part of healthcare workers and substandard facilities,
That's true.
the event garnered national attention, and the young lords who took part escaped without arrest.
What's not mentioned all the time too is I spoke about it at the church the other day. It's like the Young Lords, the Black Panther Party. These are vehicles. What fuels these vehicles are the people, right? So without the people, the vehicle doesn't move. So even when you talk about the Lincoln Hospital takeover, they wouldn't have been as successful if not having the full cooperation of the hospital staff. If the staff didn't agree and it wasn't cooperating with what they see and they knew the vision that the Young Lords had was a righteous vision, it wouldn't have been as successful. The taking over of the church, that wouldn't have been successful if people from the community wouldn't have participated and occupied the church as well. Hold on, I gotta make this verification. Yeah, so because even now, I heard it the last weekend I was at the church. People were like, "Oh, because this thing's happening in the church," and they're like, "Oh, the whole takeover," and people didn't like the way it was perpetuated when we celebrated the anniversary. And it's like a lot of people taking the fact out that the only reason the Young Lords took over the church because it was a community need, and it was also backed by the community. Like the Young Lords never do nothing without the help and support of the people because it's only amplified by the people. You can't do something for the people if you don't use it by the people. Like if the people don't have participation, with these actions, then it's not going to happen. It's not going to be successful. The reason they were so successful is because the people participated, is because they agreed with these actions. But that's what's not talked about. It's the fuel what fuels these vehicles. And I'm over here trying to press play on the computer when it's on the iPad.
Because these groups often moved between the archipelago and the United States, they were heavily surveilled. When the Young Lords decided to expand operations to the archipelago, for example, their movements were tracked by undercover agents. Similarly, the FBI's COINTELPRO not only sought to infiltrate and disband groups like the Black Panther Party, but also targeted Puerto Rican groups that were considered extremist.
And now if you look at again, Chicago went political a whole year before New York even decided to become the Young Lords, and the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover and Chicago PD and even NYPD were fully aware of the Young Lords at that time. So when they become a chapter in New York City, they were infiltrated almost immediately, and they had people who were part of the FBI, who acted like they were undercover and acting like regular people in El Barrio. Some people who dated other individuals. People of high-ranking power dated people who were in the FBI or the CIA, the FBI, right? FBI is domestic. Yeah, in the FBI. And again, this is all tactics of COINTELPRO. And this is the things that they did to the Young Lords or the Nationalist Party is not limited to them. These are things that they did to the Black Panthers Party. They did to the MOVE movement. They did to so many AIM, the students. What's they called? Ay, se me fue el avión. But you guys get what I'm saying. Let me shut up so I can finish these last 12 minutes. Let's tap that screen. We had 20K, y'all. Damn, my mouse wasn't frozen. I hit a round of applause. My mouse seems like it's frozen. Yeah, forget it. I'll give y'all a round of applause in a few.
Surveillance was something that, as scholar Marisol Lebron argues, united the insurgency across the diaspora. The Young Lords and the Seccional were not the first organizations to claim rights for Puerto Ricans in the United States.
Nah.
They built their projects on the shoulders of community activists and civic organizations that had been operating in the diaspora for decades. These new organizations signaled the turning point in how colonialism and the urgency of Puerto Rico's independence were linked to everyday life in the diaspora.
Even if you go back to, like, say, Chicago, right, and you look at a lot of these gangs that were created in early stages, like, even when you look at the Kings and you look at other groups at the time, even the Young Lords at the time, right, because the Young Lords started off as a gang around the same time as the Latin Kings. If you look at them, a lot of them were influenced by groups that their parents had put together with revolutionary ideologies and philosophies, and due to the conditions and the separation, segregation, Jim Crow, redlining, and all that, creates an environment where you're giving kids these kind of like revolutionary tools, but they also dealing with the harsh realities of their environment, which have to protect themselves, and things develop differently. And this is where you get today's cultures of gangs. And like, even that's my critique of gangs today, right? Or nations today, street nations. I come from that shit. I come from that lifestyle. And when you start growing up and you start critiquing and analyzing, like, a lot of what drew me into it, right, was the revolutionary lessons, the philosophies, the teachings. Like, they were inspiring. But when you look at the way we practice it, due to our conditions being, the crabs in a bucket, just using each other to get out, a lot of us don't practice those philosophies and ideologies. And as a lot of people get older, they start recognizing these shits, right? It's not that the lessons aren't good and not that they're not valid. It's the fact that a lot of individuals have got so corrupted with capitalism that they don't follow the same philosophies and ideologies once practiced. But I'm just showing you how it turns from the migration on coming with certain ideologies, philosophies, being put in these conditions, letting that marinate in the next generation, being fueled with what the parents are teaching them, but also dealing with the circumstances and the corruption within the system that doesn't want them to thrive. It creates what we have today as what we know, gangs. But that's just my little gist of it. That's just my opinion. Take it or leave it. It's up to you.
Armed resistance and repression. An important aspect of the new struggle for independence in Puerto Rico and the diaspora was the appearance of armed guerrilla movements. Inspired by the success of Cuban revolutionaries and Third World liberation struggles, these organizations operated clandestinely in both urban and rural settings. Since they did not have popular support, they believed that strategic actions would weaken U.S. colonialism in Puerto Rico. In part, their plan was to make Puerto Rico inhospitable to U.S. corporations and investors. One of the first armed organizations to emerge was the Comandos Armados de Liberación, or CAL, which operated from 1963 to 1972. They were responsible for 137 bombings between 1968 and 1972, generating more than $100 million in losses and resulting in the deaths of 2 U.S. Marines. In the diaspora, Chicago activists organized the Fuerzas Armadas de Liberación Nacional, or FALN, which carried out 120 bombings between 1974 and 1981.
Well, it's now spoken about, and I had to learn this too myself. The FALN has been around for a very long time before they started making headlines, and a lot of what was influencing the Spanish gangs in Chicago, at least with the philosophies and ideologies, came from some, not all, right? Please don't put words in my mouth, because I know some people from Chicago are like, nah. But if you do the history, if you look at the communities, and you look at the Puerto Rican communities, and you look at the groups, and you look at the elders, and who was preaching to the children, was a lot of members of what we know today to be the FALN members that came out of Chicago. Just a fun fact.
5 people lost their lives in FALN-led actions. Such events did not take place in a vacuum. These organizations understood their actions as part of a war against U.S. imperialism in Puerto Rico. For example, in 1971, the CAL declared Condado, a tourist destination and one of San Juan's wealthiest neighborhoods, a war zone. Armed guerrillas responded to state-sponsored terror with equal violence. On March 4th, 1970, for example, students clashed with police officers outside the UPR in Rio Piedras. As the police violently dispersed the students, some began running through adjacent Ponce de Leon Street. From her balcony, Antonia Martinez Lagares, a 20-year-old who was studying to become a Spanish teacher, screamed at the police to stop. One officer raised his gun and shot at the balcony, killing Antonia and wounding another student, Celestino Santiago Diaz. The only police officer accused of the assassination, Marcos A. Ramos, was later absolved in court. Much later, in 1991, an investigation led by the Judicial Commission of the Puerto Rican Senate stated that Ramos had been falsely accused to protect the real perpetrator. In response to Antonia's murder, the CAL organized Antonia Operation, in which they killed 2 U.S. Marines in retaliation. Right-wing paramilitary groups operating in Puerto Rico also ramped up the severity of their actions against the independence movement in the 1970s. Juan Maribras and the PSP were often targets. In December 1975, Maribras was elected as the party's candidate for governor in an assembly with more than 10,000 people in the audience. The previous year, in 1974, the PSP Seccional in New York organized an event in Madison Square Garden at which more than 12,000 people demanded independence for Puerto Rico. The PSP's expansion worried right-wing groups operating in Puerto Rico. When the PSP was preparing for the 1976 elections, Maribras received a brutal blow. His 23-year-old son, Santiago Chagui Marie Pesquera, was kidnapped in front of his house. Chagui's body was found the following day. Although one of his neighbors was arrested and subsequently convicted of the murder, a prosecutor stated in court that he could not have acted alone. These events were part of a broader trend toward extreme violence and state repression. There were politically oriented assassinations, bombings, and indiscriminate arrests throughout the decade. The police and the FBI also expanded their efforts and successfully infiltrated several leftist organizations. In 1978, for example, a young revolutionary named Alejandro González Malavé created 2 organizations, Comandos Revolucionarios Armados and Frente Armado Antiimperialista. In the span of a year, they claimed responsibility for 4 armed actions: burning down the Americans for Democratic Action Committee building, attacking Guard headquarters at the UPR, shooting up the residency of Luis Muñoz Marin, and planting a bomb in a post office. González Malavé's enthusiasm and daring actions enabled him to recruit 2 young men, Arnaldo Darío Rosado Torres and Carlos Soto Arribi, for his next act: blowing up a radio tower at Cerro Maravilla, a mountainside about 50 miles from San Juan. The date they selected, July 25, 1978, was not arbitrary. It was the anniversary of the U.S. occupation and the same day that the Commonwealth and the Puerto Rican Constitution had been inaugurated in 1952. The 3 men hijacked a taxi, forcing the driver, Julio Ortiz Molina, to take them to their destination. They were surrounded by police officers the moment they got out of the car. It was a trap. The group's leader and seasoned revolutionary with years of experience under his belt, González Malavé, immediately surrendered. Darío Rosario and Soto Arribi were likely astonished when he began screaming at the police officers not to shoot him. He was one of theirs. Alejandro González Malavé was an undercover agent. Darío Rosado Torres and Soto Arribi were
Yo, what I just told you about the undercover agents.
executed after
Don't
they had
shoot.
surrendered.
I'm one of you.
Governor Carlos Romero Barceló from the Partido Nuevo Progresista, or PNP, called the officers heroes, arguing that
Yeah, I've spoken to elders from the Young Lords, from the Panthers, from the Brown Berets. Yo, it got so wicked that people didn't even realize that they were sleeping with the enemy. Like, that's how crazy the government went. The limps. People were with people for years. Relationship and all that, and didn't even know that wasn't even who they say they were.
Those who carry guns and pistols, who go with bombs, those who kill must be prepared to die. Maravilla's aftermath. The events at Maravilla did not end that day. They dominated the election cycles of 1982 and 1986. Governor Romero Barceló won his second bid for governor in 1982, but his party lost the Senate majority to the Populares. The government's official account of what had happened at Maravilla was that the young men had shot at the police, who had killed them in self-defense. When the taxi driver was interviewed, however, he contradicted that narrative. The PPD-dominated Senate ordered an investigation into what had happened that day. The public hearings began in 1983. They were televised and garnered national attention. It was proven in court that the young men had been executed, and the agents involved had committed perjury. The case created a political storm.
Listen.
In 1986, Romero Barceló lost his third re-election bid. 10 officers were suspended. Alejandro González Malavé was removed from the force, acquitted on all charges, and then assassinated by an armed leftist organization. But the televised court cases revealed more than just that the government had officially lied. A police officer misspoke under pressure while being interviewed and gave away another state secret that everyone had suspected for years. The Puerto Rican Police's Department of Intelligence had been surveilling people for decades and had carpetas, files, on thousands of Puerto Ricans.
Really quick, the whole book, War Against Puerto Ricans, is based off the carpetas. Nelson Dennis, paid for the Freedom of Information Act, paid his couple of dollars, got his files, and he said in his words alone, and Nelson Dennis's words himself, right, said he acquired enough documents to write about 10 books on Puerto Rico and on how they were surveilling people. And there's millions of documents that he hasn't received. So imagine. Like, we know what COINTELPRO did to the Black Panthers because we learned somewhat about it, right? But we don't know to the lengths that they go through when they're on foreign soil, where a lot of domestic repercussions may not occur for the government.
In an unprecedented move, the Puerto Rican...
And this is not a competition. I'm not saying one's better than or less than. It's just to show you the lengths that the FBI and the federal government go through. Because I don't need nobody ignorant hitting me in the comments talking about competition on trauma.
Courts later concluded that the carpetas had been illegally created and ruled they should be given to those affected. The pages detailed how for 3 decades the Puerto Rican government had created a sophisticated system of surveillance. But the state had not acted alone.
But this goes... Who enforced it? The U.S. government, right? Who was taking the lead on that? J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover was a lot of people's nightmares, even within the U.S. government. He had a lot of blackmail on people because what he did was surveillance, was be able to acquire as much information he needs on people to be able to use it to his advantage. And then again, you can't take out the fact that he does work for the government.
The carpetas confirmed that neighbors, co-workers, and even comrades in the struggle had been collaborating with the police. These documents had also served as a database to target and blacklist those deemed subversives.
Right.
As sociologist Jose Anasagasti has noted, those who were carpeteados were denied job and study opportunities and suffered discrimination, persecution, illegal arrest, imprisonment, and even death. The term carpeteo became part of Puerto Rican slang for being surveilled, demonstrating the impact that this program had on the collective imaginary. The carpetas became an archive of state anxieties, fears, and everyday violence. Unlike other truth and reconciliation processes in different parts of the world, there was no state-led reckoning that could provide some meaning to the carpetas while acknowledging the government's wrongdoing. These events served as the backdrop for an economic crisis that would profoundly impact Puerto Rico for decades to come.
That was a good 2 chapters. We're going to pick up tomorrow. We got 3 hours and 5 minutes. So I say we got tomorrow and the day after tomorrow to actually finish up this book. So I think about 2 more settings and we'll be completely done with this. Yeah, I really appreciate everybody who tapped in today, who showed me some love and support. Yeah, don't forget, we are going back to Puerto Rico in May 2nd to the 10th. We will be back in Puerto Rico for the Young Lords Back to Borinquen project. We will be at the Marco Sanchez Community Center. So don't forget, all gifts and donations donated to my platform, the Cash App and everything, will be going to the Young Lords Back to Borinquen project. So if you guys want to help, participate, donate, whatever you guys want, you guys are more than welcome. It's open doors to participate. We may not be able to finance for you to come, but if you get down there, you're more than welcome to come help volunteer. We need as much hands as possible, and you guys can go out, look it up. Please look up the Marco Sanchez Community Center at Yabucoa, Puerto Rico. The one that's leading the front over there right now is Yolanda. She's very, very dope lady. Got a lot of love for her. But we're going back down there. This will be our 5th trip to Yabucoa in the last 2 years. So again, guys, we try to go every 6 to 8 months. So if you miss one trip and you want to go, and you want to link, or you down there, you want to participate, don't worry about it. We constantly going, because this is our attempt at building bridges with the motherland, because a lot of division between us and them, because of all the historical content that we listen to today. We can see how easy it is for individuals to cause separation between individuals who share continuous struggle. But I appreciate all the love. Don't forget, go on my YouTube. This episode will be uploaded up there, but I also uploaded it's my 3rd children's book out of my graphic novel. It's on YouTube. The rest of them aren't up there, but I'm using it for a project this weekend, so I decided to upload it for you guys. So if you guys want to go listen to the audio version of the Young Lords community story joint effort, which also has the Black Panthers in this episode, you guys want to go check it out, go sit with your kids, nieces, nephews, grandkids. Shit, not for nothing, I enjoy listening to it a couple times myself. Every elder and every member that I sent it to, they had fun. So go check that out, show me some love, and I'm gonna end it again with my poem. You know how I like to start and end it with my poem. My journey these past couple of years hasn't been easy. Good, bad, or indifferent, it was worth it. Throughout my journey, I had so many inspirations, so many things that made me see things in a different light, even view myself from a different perspective, understanding that I don't have to be just another statistic, that I can seek to be who I want to be, not who they set out for me to be. With that being said, this is my response to the legendary Pedro Pedri's Puerto Rican obituary, Puerto Rican resurrection. Let's get it. Hold up. What's going on? We've let too much time pass. It's been going on for far too long, struggling just to survive. Things seem so wrong. We worked. We were always on time. We were never late, just trying to survive. If it wasn't for Juan, Miguel, Milagro, Olga, Manuel, I would still be in denial. All dying for an American dream, waiting for their lottery numbers to hit, the promotion that never came, and a system that never gave a fuck from the beginning. So understanding and learning everything they struggled through, why do we continue to keep the cycle going? While screaming, yo soy boricua, pa que tú lo sepa. Please tell me, what good does that do if we continue to contribute to the system that has us where we're at? And I'm not saying you gotta be the next Captain Puerto Rico, I'm not saying all that. But let's look at the facts. So from 1493 until 1898, Spain ruled the island of Borinquen. And within that time, we'd had massive genocide. So many people died on both sides. And what do I mean by both sides? Our Afro and Taino side that we could never deny, because we hold with so much pride everything they went through just to survive, while the conquistadors took the whole island on a ride, committing so many criminal acts that words can never describe. 1898, Here comes big old Tío Sam, el savior de Puerto Rico, decreasing the currency by 40%. Cause who needs to survive when you got Tío Sam's checks by your side? Can't forget about the imposement of citizenship, forcing us to rely, while Tío Sam takes a ride on the road of taxation without representation, and that comes with a lot of exploitation. Oh, what a great nation of which we reside. But what I realize, if you remove us from history, we don't see a future. This is why it's important to understand who is Pedro Avisu Campos, who is Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, who is Lolita Lebron, who is Ramon Emeterio Betances, who is Mariana Bracetti, who are the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, who are the Young Lords. All representation of greatness, all in their own right. But we are them and they are us, fighting for the same cause, liberation, self-determination, with no limitations. So we won't be dying, hating the make-believe steaks or the bulletproof rice and beans, or waiting for the supervisor to die to get that promotion. We will die freeing our bodies without having to use physical strength, but by arming ourselves with knowledge and education, not just for now, but for the future. Viva Puerto Rico libre, pa'lante, siempre pa'lante. Appreciate everybody, appreciate everybody. I appreciate all the love. I appreciate all the love. And like I said, everybody, I will be at the People's Church on 111th Street in Lexington from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. We will be celebrating Three Kings Day. We will be giving out free clothes, free food, music, all the whole nine, entertainment. I will be playing my children's book for the kids who come down there, because we are giving out free books to the community, to the kids that we've collected from donations. So if you guys want to come down there, participate, join the festivities. We're trying to make El Barrio again. So I hope to see you guys there. Peace, blessings, positivity. I'll catch you guys mañana.